Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graban. Our guest today is Mike Grossman. He's a six-time Silicon Valley CEO who spent nearly 3 decades leading early-stage venture-backed technology companies. Before becoming a serial entrepreneur, Mike worked at McKinsey, Johnson & Johnson, and Intuit. So over his career, he's raised capital from 12 venture firms and lived through everything from a $400 million acquisition to fire sale endings. His new book, and you'll recognize he is in the perfect place here on the podcast. His new book out now is called Failure is an Option: Reflections of a Silicon Valley CEO. 44 essays on what running a startup actually looks like when the cameras aren't on. So, Mike, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you here. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for writing a book that doesn't just filter out the bad to present the good of being, a perfect entrepreneur and a perfect leader with a perfect track record. I really do admire you taking the approach that you did in the book.
I appreciate it. It's when I decided to write a book, I was thinking about how to go about doing it. What I realized was that most business books are either how-to books, on how do you sell or how do you market or how do you raise money, or they are effectively the hero's journey, some form of biography or autobiography that is burnishing a legacy in a sense. And
Yeah.
I don't really relate to either of those books in a sense. I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to provide more of an authentic view of what it actually feels like to run one of these companies. Because they most definitely, at least in general, or at least in my experience, are not the hero's journey. They're a roller coaster of unpredictable consequences.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back and talk more about the book. And to me, it's heroic to admit to speak candidly about struggles and mistakes and failures or whatever word that we use. So, I know you're in the right place, and I know you're expecting this question before we go back and talk about the book. Mike, what's your favorite mistake?
Favorite mistake, yeah. So we give a little bit of backstory. I went to law school, even though essentially my whole career has been in business, but went to Harvard Law School back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, and I spent a couple of summers working in law firms, and that's important to this story. So many years on, it was the first of the six companies that I've run, and a company that I co-founded. And we had a kind of wild journey for many years, but eventually got to the point where we were starting to make meaningful progress. And we forged a deal with a company named Experian, which a company and
Yep.
the context in which we were dealing with Experian was directly competitive to Dun& Bradstreet.
Mhm.
And in fact, our product, which was trade credit management software, competed with something that D&B offered. So in order to save some money, I decided that I would act as my own lawyer. And when it came to relationship with Experian, I wouldn't contract it out to somebody else. I would actually deal with the contract. It didn't look that complicated. It was a relatively short distribution arrangement. So I dealt with it myself and thought nothing of it. And then a couple of years later, we were making very significant progress. Dun & Bradstreet contacted us and expressed interest in buying our company. And so for various reasons, Experian wasn't in a position to do likewise. And of course, we couldn't share with Experian that we were having this conversation with Dun & Bradstreet. But we went down the path, and I started to review all of the contracts, again, in the spirit of saving money and not paying good legal fees. And I got to the Experian agreement, and I read it, and I thought, I think I didn't think it said this. And I read it a second time, and I read it a third time, and I realized with horror that I really had made a very significant mistake. And there was a sentence that could be read in two ways. And the way that I had read it was harmless, but the way that it could also be equally interpreted to say would prevent us from selling the company to anybody without Experian's explicit permission. And I didn't know what to do. And I
Yeah.
went to the board of directors, and they all read the sentence and they said, "Don't worry about it. Your first reading is the most likely interpretation. Let's just see if D&B notices it. It'll be fine." And then I went Bill Campbell, who is he's the $1 trillion coach, if you're familiar with that book, and he was my mentor and friend and advised a lot of people in Silicon Valley. And he looked at it and he said, "No, your board of directors is completely wrong. I completely disagree. That shit, it's going to destroy the deal. You have to contact Experian. You have to convince them to let you out of the deal." And I ended up, I couldn't believe that was the recommendation or figure out how I would actually pull it off.
Yeah.
But I did what he advised. I listened to him instead of the rest of the board. And thankfully, the guy at Experian, the end, he listened. I said, "This deal would mean a lot to us. And I can't tell you who it's with, but would appreciate if you let us out of the contract." And he did. And sure enough, a week later, D&B noticed. They read the contract and they said, "You got a big problem. We can't do this deal." And I said, "No, the deal has been ended." And sure enough, in the end, the acquisition was completed. So it worked out in the end, but this was an enormous mistake. And I call it my favorite mistake because not only did I learn something significant, but thankfully out in the end, it wasn't irreparable. I was able to fix it thanks to some very good advice and a very gracious person at Experian and a little bit of luck.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, that's a great illustration. I mean, for one, I'm glad it didn't have catastrophic impacts to you, but it illustrates how there's still an opportunity to learn from a mistake that didn't cause a huge failure instead of just judging the outcome. That shows some good reflection. I appreciate you doing
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I saved $5,000 probably, but I imperiled millions of dollars in the process. I thought it was one of the most significant mistakes I've ever made. And the fact that in the end it worked out, that was fortuitous, but it was really dumb. And I've never made that mistake again. I made many other mistakes, but not that.
Well, sure. But yeah, so the countermeasure was to stop serving as your own attorney.
That's right. And to recognize that even though I went to law school and ostensibly I'm sort of a lawyer, that there's an old adage that the person who uses, how does it go? It's um, the person who acts as their own lawyer has a fool for a client. Was definitely me.
Uh, Now, is it a matter of getting somebody with fresh eyes on the situation, somebody who is going to be a little more detached and impartial? Having someone else be the attorney, is that a mistake that another attorney might have also made?
I think it's possible, but there is something to be said for experience, and it's funny, early in my career, I think I dismissed the value of experience before I had all gray hair. Well, if you're really motivated, you work hard, and you're adaptable, and you're smart, you can figure out pretty much anything. And on some level, I still believe that, but now with the benefit of lots of gray hair in a lot of decades of mistakes and failures and so on, I do think that experience has a significant value. So it's pattern recognition. If you were to work with a lawyer in this case who's seen many of these agreements, they're more likely to see that it's not written in the best possible way. And I suspect in today's AI environment, it would probably be picked up automatically. But at the time, I didn't have that benefit.
Yeah. But that mindset that you describe of, we're smart, we'll work hard, we can figure anything out. That's the mindset you need to have really to be an entrepreneur, right?
I think so. And I think it's true. I mean, there's in a lot of cases, you just have to figure it out as you go. The benefit of experience is that you often can get from point A to point B quicker because you've seen what not to do in many cases. But you can get from point A to point B if you're proactive and industrious and adaptable, regardless of experience. In my view.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a general lesson. I'm not an attorney. For other listeners who are not attorneys, we can't make that exact same mistake you did, but it seems like the general lesson is knowing your limitations or knowing your lack of experience in a certain area. And even if you could figure it out, like what should you bring in an expert to do? I mean, that might include everything from like, building a landing page, building a website, other things. You're like, well, I could do it, but should I?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other part of the lesson is it's sometimes easy to be penny wise and pound foolish.
Yeah.
And as an entrepreneur, you constantly have to make decisions with respect to what you invest in, and you have to be very careful about how you spend money. And when
Mhm.
they're aging, I think people tend to have a systemic bias to spending too much money as opposed
Yes.
to too little. But there are moments, and it's usually the moments that have the greatest potential significance or ramification where it often is necessary to spend more as opposed to less.
Yeah. I mean, even in a big company environment, you're giving me a flashback. I mean, I've used this phrase in other episodes, but when I was at General Motors 30 years ago, there was this common expression, we'll save money no matter how much it costs us.
Mm. Oh, that's a good quote.
There's a similar kind of penny wise, pound foolish short, and a lot of it was really just short-term thinking. Like, we
Yeah,
can save some money today. It might come back and bite us in the butt next week.
yeah,
And that's
that's
a
right.
different corporate dynamic. I'm sorry, I cut what was that?
No, no, I agree with that. It's in some sense, it's a question of how much you invest in insurance, different forms of insurance as a company. And if you spend too much money on what might go wrong, then you end up wasting a lot of money. But if you spend too little, sometimes things actually go wrong.
Yeah, yeah. So, the premise here, in this series is, mistakes can be really useful teachers. You've shared an example of that here, but in an organization, we can only learn from mistakes if people feel safe admitting them. So, I'm curious, stepping back to your experience as a CEO, how do you create an environment where people, feel free to surface bad news early and instead of hiding it until it might be too late?
I think the key is in how you react when bad news is shared.
Mhm.
And I've always been of the view that it's good when people share bad news and you need to acknowledge that. Not because the news itself is exciting, but because if
Right.
bad news is made visible, you can actually do something about it. Certainly in the companies I've run, one of the main things that I've emphasized is that no one's going to get shot for sharing bad news. I mean, if anything, they're going to be complimented for making it visible and keeping things authentic. I think when people see that and that it's real, it's not just rhetoric, that
Yeah.
when bad things happen and they talk about it and they're not blamed for it for either a scapegoat or really just to, giving somebody a hard time, you're focused on working at whatever the problem is. You end up in a much better environment. And I've certainly been in companies, there've been companies I've been recruited into where I don't think that that was the culture prior to my joining. One of the things that I try to work on because you'll see patterns where people will try to sweep bad news under the rug.
Mhm.
They don't want to get in trouble or they don't want to get other people in trouble. There's a lot of reasons why people hide
Right.
bad news, but it's never a good thing. In some sense, I think a business has all about solving problems. That's what we
Mhm.
do. We try
Mhm.
problems that emerge in the short term. We try to anticipate problems that might emerge in the long term.
Yeah.
Much of it is around problem solving. You can't solve a problem if you don't acknowledge that the problem exists.
Right. Yeah, and as a leader, you can't get involved in solving the problem if, people aren't bringing it forward to even be acknowledged.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I've been in environments where people just want to talk about good news, and that's not a sustainably successful approach, in my
Yeah.
view, because what ends up happening is that the problems get neglected.
Yeah. And I love how you put that, there needs to be, to paraphrase a little bit, real action, not just rhetoric. Because people get burned if it's some version of the boss saying, like, "I've got an open door policy. You can bring anything to me." And then if
Um,
the boss if you don't get a good reaction, you might think, "The door's open, but I'm not gonna use it again." Right?
Absolutely true. I just couldn't agree more. It's Rhetoric is easy. I mean, it's, but if you really want to make values real, you have to live. And it takes a while to build trust with people on a team in a way. It's very easy to lose it
Mm.
if you're not being real or authentic or you're just being performative.
Yeah.
But if you mean it and you live it and demonstrate it and have a team that over time operates that way, it's a not only does it lead to greater success, but it's a lot more fun. It's a much better environment to work in.
Yeah. Um, to talk about something that's not fun. I mean, you have three essays about layoffs, headcount reductions. You
Yeah.
write about being quote unquote the Lord High Executioner. Um, one thing that was really interesting, you said when CEOs are in a position where it seems like reducing headcount is necessary, they shouldn't. It would be a mistake. I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently. It would be a mistake to trust your instincts, and that. Let me just ask you, let me hear it from you instead of me saying it. The most common mistake, or at least a common mistake, when it comes to layoffs and numbers.
I think most common mistake is that people cut too little,
Mm.
is too much. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that very often, if you have a team of a certain size, you can sort of imagine how to bring that down to some extent, but beyond some threshold, it's very hard to envision it working. And often what I've found is if you bring it down to that first level, you realize immediately that you actually could have gone further in the first place and that it's much harder to do that. The second reason is most people are nice. They don't want to lay people off. I mean, it's
Right.
a miserable thing to do and halfway.
Right.
And so people avoid it because it's very unpleasant. And the consequence of that is that they try to minimize it where possible. And yeah, in my experience, it's better to be very tough-minded about it. I mean, empathetic, yes, but tough-minded
Right.
at the same time, because in the end of the day, you're running a business. The long-term viability of the business is what you're trying to figure out, and sometimes that requires difficult decisions, and that requires boldness in a way, even if it's dealing with something that's very unpleasant and has adverse consequences for people.
Yeah. So I mean, how'd you arrive at that rule of thumb, or I mean, was it
Well, I'm
experience, mistake?
It didn't maybe it wasn't my favorite mistake, it was my second favorite mistake. I mean, it was, but it's on the list. I mean, I didn't do it right the first time. I did
Yeah.
exactly what I'm describing. I had a company that needed to reduce headcount, and we reduced headcount 40%. I actually had one, venture investor who suggested that we should reduce headcount by something like 80%, and I thought he didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know much about the company, the guy who had made that suggestion. So we went down by 40% and we got there and I realized, oh, I actually could have gone down by 60% instead of 40% and in fact should have.
Yeah.
And then eventually adjusted that and went down 60%. And then in the longer term, realized that the guy was right all along. It should have gone down by 80%. And the problem with doing it in these types of stages is that you end up losing credibility because you go in front of the team and you say, you have to do this. It's very painful, but this is it. And then 3 months later, you have to come
Yeah.
back. Well, it really wasn't it. Now it's
Yeah.
it again.
Yeah.
And it ends up being a death by a thousand cuts. And it's just, it's not a good situation to find oneself in. So yeah, I learned that lesson painfully and have tried to not make that mistake again.
Yeah. I mean, it's a mistake to make a commitment that you can't guarantee that you can hold to, just in
Right.
general leadership, right?
In life. Right.
In
And
life. Yeah.
of course, conditions can change. So even if in a very authentic, high integrity way, you make a commitment, you may not, the situation can change and you're forced to, that's a little bit different than when it's really an unforced error or an error based on inexperience. And so, yeah, if you make a commitment, but you actually have the information necessary to make the right decision, you really want to keep the commitment. But in the case I described, I mean, I realized that I had made a mistake, and certainly the 40% to 60%, that was an enormous amount of money that the company really needed to save. And yet I had made effectively a commitment that we weren't going to go down further. uh, in the end, so I delayed doing it again because I pretty, and then, but in the end, I had to do it because the business needed to survive. And otherwise, if you don't make these decisions, you don't lose 40% or 60%, you lose 100% because the
Right.
business are out of business. And that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. Are there times where there's a real, I want to say trade-off. That's not exactly the word I'm looking for. That there's this battle between long-term viability of the company versus short-term pressures, whether that's cash flow pressure, your investors putting pressure on you, how to navigate that.
I mean, these are very challenging. It's a very challenging issue to navigate. I mean, the context in which I've run companies has been venture capital funded. These are companies that are in the early days, always on the verge of running out of money. And so you you need to survive to be able to have long-term success. You have to, otherwise you go out of business. So you're forced very often to make trade-offs in the short term based on resource constraints. And
Yeah.
if you could wave a wand and have a lot more money for a
Yeah.
it would be much easier, but it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah. It would be a mistake to think it's easy for sure.
Yeah. It's a lot harder than I realized, that's for sure, when I first started.
Yeah. One other thing, Mike, that you wrote about is, it's well known Silicon Valley sells itself as a meritocracy, but
Mm.
you make the argument that luck and timing often matter more. And I'm sure that could be tough for people to accept. How do you tell the difference? Um, or how do you explain those dynamics to people that luck and timing might matter more than you would like to admit?
Yeah. I mean, there are certain prerequisites to build a successful company. I mean, you really do have to work hard. You have to have a team that works hard. You have to have a team that's talented. I mean, you have to be addressing a real customer need. You have to do that in a good way and so on. You can't get away from that. If you don't do those things, you have no chance. But just because you do those things doesn't mean that you're going to succeed. You
Yeah.
might succeed or you might not succeed. And a lot of that has to do with timing and luck, as you were just referencing. And that's just reality. And I think what happens a lot of times is that a company will succeed in a big way. And the folks who are involved with the company would like to believe that that's really a reflection of how great a job they did.
Mhm.
It is to some extent, I'm sure, but it also has to do with these other factors. And I've seen it in my own life. I mean, the sixth of my six companies had a very good outcome at the end, better actually than the previous five. But I can honestly say that I didn't think I did a better job at that company than I had done at some of the other companies. And more profoundly, I didn't think that the management team or the team overall was better. They were good, but they weren't better necessarily than other companies that I had run that I also thought had very good teams. But the outcome ended up being very different. And so, in my view, there's a certain amount of humility that I think is important in a way when running an entrepreneurial business. You have to try to do the best you can, and often that'll work out. But to some extent, you can make your own luck. But you also have to accept that you don't control everything. That you control what you can control, and sometimes things, as I write in the book, things just happen, and sometimes those things are good, and sometimes those things are bad, and and really, entrepreneurial business is a microcosm of life. Good things, bad things happen in a kind of random sequence. And sometimes things are good, sometimes things are bad. Sometimes it's the opposite order. It reminds me of one of the comments my father's father, my grandfather, used to say about the stock market. He said, the stock market goes up and down, but not necessarily in that order. And that's basically my view of the fortunes of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Um, Makes me think of a different related expression that you hear in ads or disclaimers. Past performance does not guarantee future results.
That's true.
And you win some, you lose some, if you will. You, Mike, are the same CEO in different situations, but what I sense from you is that you're not the same you're the same person, but you're not the same CEO each time because you seem really driven to learn and you're gaining experience and hopefully you're a better version of yourself each time. But that still doesn't mean that a past success guarantees a future success, right?
That's right. I mean, I'm in some sense, or I've been the same person to some extent. I mean, my values, I think, have been consistent
Hmm.
throughout.
Hmm.
Certainly, I'm much more experienced now than I was at the beginning, and that has both strengths and weaknesses, I think, associated with it. But let's say I do it again and run a seventh company, which is something that actually interests me. It's impossible to know how well that company will do or how I'll approach it. It'll totally depend on the dynamics of that situation.
Hmm.
What are the company's strengths and weaknesses, the team's strengths and weaknesses? I'll try to apply the experiences I've had. But also, what I've learned is you can't be too literal in applying what you've experienced because every situation is different. If I heard I think it was around company five where I thought to myself before I joined, I've done so many of these things now. I've kind of seen it all. And then
Hmm.
I got into the new role and I thought on my second day, I thought, yeah, I haven't seen this before. And no, maybe if you did 100 of them, if we live long enough to be able to do that, you would really see it all. But that certainly with an N equals six in my case, and I've been on a bunch of boards as well. So if you count
Yeah.
those, N equals 15. But no,
Yeah.
every situation is different, and the dynamics are different. The world is different, and so it's kind of unpredictable how it plays out.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, yeah, yeah. You shared that hypothesis that you've seen it all. And I guess, I mean, and this applies in different situations too. Better to have a incorrect hypothesis shot down on day two than down the road. Better to learn that sooner than later, I guess. So there's the humility. We could say we're humble, but there are some humbling experiences.
Yeah, I think one of the best. I work right on humility. I think one of the best aspects of regarding things that way is that you don't assume you know what the right answer is,
Uh-huh.
and you don't assume that an answer that applied uh, well previously in a different setting in a different company will necessarily work. You might have that as a hypothesis. You might say, I've seen a version of this before. I think this might work, but it's important to realize, yeah, maybe not.
Mhm.
It's not. These things are not apples to apples. You can apply pattern recognition to some extent, and that gets you maybe 80% of the way there, but
Mhm.
the other 20% often makes the difference between success and failure.
Yeah. So building off of values a little bit, one other thing you write about is how a lot of Silicon Valley companies have really aspirational missions, but ultimately money becomes a factor. How do you keep a team motivated on the mission when the financial scorecard is challenging?
Well, I think what I've seen is that it comes back to the issue of what motivates people to work for one company or another.
Hmm.
Because most of the people who work in the Silicon Valley companies that I've been part of have a alternative. They can it might take them a month or it might take them 6 months, but they're going to find another job doing something more or less similar. And then the question is, well, why do they choose your company? And if the answer is it's all only based on money, in other words, if you have a group of people that is just very commercial or mercenary, if you would judgmental word, if that's kind of their nature, if you hit any sort of financial adversity, they'll immediately leave.
Yeah.
And that's not a great scenario. But if you have a group of people who really like working together and they like what the company stands for and they like the company's mission and you're genuine about that mission in terms of what you're trying to do for customers, how people treat each other within the company. If you can do that successfully, build an environment that people are really motivated by and excited by and feel good about, then they're much likelier to stick when things don't go as well financially. because there's a sense of kind of community purpose. So I've always thought in any company that I'm in that the goal is to get people to feel like this is the best company they've ever worked for. And that's an elusive goal, right? I mean, not everyone's going to feel that way,
Sure.
but that's got to be the goal. So when I think about how do you build a great company, some of that is, of course, financial results and impact on customers, but some of it is that issue relating to the people who work in the company is them feeling like, this is really a great place. Doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean that the company always does well, but it's a place where that aligns with their values, and it's a it's at least the right aspiration, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it becomes a cliche. Or I know, like back in the HBO series Silicon Valley, it was kind of a running joke about making the world a better place,
Yeah.
and that sounds good. But I mean, is there a point where, let's say, somebody's got, I'm going to make up a scenario. It's some sort of fintech company that does some sort of just really technical grunt work, sort of credit card processing sort of thing. I mean, like is it a mistake to try to attach too much of a making the world a better place mission as opposed to saying like, well, hey, we are a company that serves customers and it saves them money and we make money and that's okay. Or
Yes, I mean, if you overstate a company's mission in kind of the Silicon Valley way you're describing, it just becomes an exercise in performative BS, really. It's not credible, right? It's
yeah,
just so the truth is a lot of companies, maybe most companies, I think of them as widget companies or widget businesses.
sure.
There's no really higher order purpose that the company is serving. And I will say, I've always preferred actually running companies that do have a genuinely higher order sort of aspiration.
Yeah.
But many are not like that, and many successful businesses are just providing a product or service that meets a need.
Mm.
So I think it's important not to overstate that. But having said that, within your little part of the world, you are having an impact on a lot of people. You're having an impact on
Mhm.
your product or service. You're having an impact on the people who work for the company. You're having an impact on the people who have invested in the company.
Mm.
You have a lot of constituents, and even within the employee group, you're having an impact indirectly on their partners, family,
Yeah.
and so without overstating what
Mhm.
you know grand grand purpose you're serving, I think it is important to sort of think about that whole ecosystem and say, within this little part of the world, we're going to try to make it better. We're going to try to do a really
Mhm.
great job for everybody, at least as best we can. And I think if you can do that, you're much more likely to end with a motivated team
Mhm.
and happy customers and a successful company.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate the way you're kind of recalibrating that in a local way. I mean, so, that expression is making the world a better place. We could make our company, our workplace environment a better place. We can have a great
Mm.
workplace and that has impacts beyond your compensation package. I mean, it has impacts on I've seen studies that show an impact not only on mental health, but on physical health when you
Okay.
have a really highly engaging, positive, and work environment. And that doesn't mean I think like that there's never any stress, but like on the whole, a workplace that's treating people well really does have a big impact on our health and our lives.
And I certainly believe that. And then more broadly, I think that if you can make your little part of the world a better place, in some sense, you are making the world a better place.
Yeah,
You're at least contributing to that
yeah,
civility.
yeah. Maybe one other thing to ask you about here, Mike. And again, Mike Grossman is our guest. His new book, Failure is an Option: Reflections of a Silicon Valley CEO. One other thing you reflect on is the level of, you could frame it as honesty, or people might talk about radical candor or transparency. Yeah, in your experience, how much should employees know about the finances, the bank balance, the burn rate? What did you learn, about finding the right approach there?
I mean, my bias is to be very open about all that and just here's the burn. Here's, and you obviously can't talk about certain confidential information, but things
Yeah.
like what is person A paid, for example, or person B is having some sort of problem, and and you got to keep some of that secret. But
Mhm.
generally, I think you share almost everything with the larger group, and certainly that's my view. I don't think it's done that way in a lot of companies, but I think it should be. Uh, you want people in part to know what's happening, but also to trust that they're being treated in an open, honest, and direct way. And one of the benefits of that, I think the reason to do that is because that's the right thing to do. Let me just say that. But I do it's a practical benefit, which is that if you really walk the walk in terms of that approach, when things get difficult and you really need people's trust, you've earned that trust.
Yeah. And just extending that a little bit, in your experience, like what is there benefit to being pretty transparent about, let's say, retrospectives on customers that you didn't win, of why you lost to a competitor or why a customer didn't renew, being open and transparent about that.
100%. I think generally you you set goals as a business and you achieve some and you don't achieve others, and where you haven't achieved it, you should be completely open about the fact that it wasn't achieved and try to deconstruct why not. And where customers are concerned, if you want to be great at serving customers, the only way to do that in part is to be absolutely real and authentic about when you don't do things well,
Mhm.
because then you can fix it, not just for that individual customer, but systemically for all customers.
Mhm.
So I believe in that. I believe in being open about victories, but also open about defeats and improvement opportunities. And in fact, I think most of the time should be spent focused on the things that need improvement,
Mhm.
because that's the way you build a great company. If you only talk about the things that are going well, then all of the problems will fester. Now, of course, you want to talk about things that go well also. You don't want
Yeah.
to only focus on the things that are not going well. But I think that you need to see the full picture. I certainly have a strong conviction in terms of that.
Yeah. And then I think one of the most difficult things I've seen or been exposed to is when, let's say, a company has the first hire that doesn't work out, the quote unquote bad hire. And that doesn't mean bad person, but it's did
Right.
for whatever various reasons doesn't work out. Sometimes there's HR related issues you have to be careful about, but are there times where kind of an open and honest retrospective, when it comes to hiring someone that didn't work out can be a good learning opportunity for the company or even just the executive team.
Yes, but you do have to be careful when if you're moving somebody out of the organization. And so I would never, in front of a company meeting, for example, say this person has been let go and this is why they've been let go. I mean, you have to be kind of careful, I think, and
Mhm.
respectful of the person who's been impacted by that.
Sure.
But certainly you can talk generally around the need for the company to be faster moving or more analytical or more collaborative. And so there are certain themes that you can emphasize, and people can to some extent read between the lines at times when it comes to that. But I do think you have to be sensitive to
Sure.
to people.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to damage somebody's reputation, especially if it was something where it was a matter of fit and, somebody that
Absolutely.
isn't, again, not a bad performer, not a bad person. They're very likely to be successful someplace else. Yeah. You have to be careful
Absolutely.
about. Or I should ask you as an attorney, it could become a legal issue.
Oh, sure. It absolutely can.
Yeah.
But I will say that there's a liability or potential liability side of it. But when it comes to difficult people related issues, I think that often is the area that the reason to be cautious and discreet is has more to do with integrity and respect than anything else.
Mhm. Well, Mike, one final question. I mean, there's a lot of candor and discussion of failures and mistakes in your book. And again, I admire that. Was there one of the 44 essays or any of the stories there where you kind of wondered, like, should I really include that or
Oh,
no?
yes, I suppose so. I mean, there's a couple of the stories I talk about. Uh, I tried to not mention the names of people who reported into me,
Sure.
either directly or indirectly. But I do mention some of the names of the people where it was selling the company to another organization where, um, there were, certain challenges that I was in the interaction. And so I thought on a couple of occasions that this is pretty open when I'm talking about. But in the end, I tried to be respectful in all the stories that I've described, and that really was again coming back to the objective of the book is I want to make people understand what it really feels like, and in order to do that, it's important to explore not just good news, but the challenges that people face. And it's not just operational, it's emotional, it's ethical, it's deeply personal.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I guess I wrestled with several of the chapters in the book, but in the end, I didn't stop myself from including any of them.
Sure. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for the book. I'm grateful that your team sent a copy and recommend people go get the book. It's available now. Again, the title is Failure is an Option, Reflections of a Silicon Valley CEO. Many times over, six-time CEO, maybe seventh time to come. Mike Grossman, thank you again for being a great guest here today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.